You quote the Bible where it suits you, but you ignore all those sections of the Bible which exclude the idea of immortality.
There is not a single text in Scripture opposed to the Catholic doctrine of immortality.
Genesis tells us that God guarded the tree of life lest men should eat of it and live forever. Man cannot therefore have immortality by nature.
The reference in Genesis is to preservation from that natural death of the composite human being which results from the dissolution of the union between soul and body. It is true that death in that sense is natural to man, for although the soul is a spirit and immortal by its very nature, the body is by nature material and mortal. God gave our first parents the special privilege by a supernatural gift of immunity even from the law of natural death. The reference you quote merely indicates that after sin had been committed, such immunity was lost irrevocably to humanity. We are all subject to the law of death and to the necessity of separation between soul and body when the body is no longer fitted for the purposes of life. But the soul survives this dissolution, and nothing in the passage you quote suggests that it does not.
In Genesis 2:17, God told Adam that he would die if he ate the forbidden fruit.
That is true, but when God spoke, Adam possessed the natural life of body and soul, and also the supernatural life and the spiritual order of God's grace. He was also, by special privilege, immune from that natural death which results from dissolution of soul and body. When he sinned, Adam lost the grace of God, his soul dying immediately to the supernatural life it gave, and also he at once forfeited any right to the privilege of immunity from natural bodily death in due course.
In Genesis 3:4, Satan said, "Ye shall not surely die."
Correct. Our first parents, therefore, had either to believe God, treating Satan as a liar, or else to believe Satan, treating God as a liar. They preferred the word of Satan and became subject to the penalty of death in the sense I have explained.
Well, did not Rome get its doctrine of immortality from the word of Satan?
No, and such a conjecture would be as erroneous as that of the enemies of Christ who accused him of casting out devils with the help of the devil.
Well, Satan said men would not die.
The doctrine of immortality is not a denial of death in the sense Satan intended. The death God had threatened was the separation of the soul from his grace and friendship, and the later separation of the soul from the body. He did not threaten such a radical change in the very nature of the soul that it would cease to be immortal. Our denial that the soul will cease to exist is in no way based on Satan's denial of God's threat and has no connection with it at all.
The book of Job declares that man is mortal.
Man, consisting of body and soul, is certainly subject to death. No one denies that man, as a composite being in this life, is mortal. All must die. But whilst we bury the body from which the soul has departed, the soul lives on in a state beyond our control. And the continued life of the soul does not render Job's statement false, nor does Job's statement render the doctrine of the soul's immortality false.
Job 33:18 through 30 speaks of the soul as in danger of destruction.
The word soul is there used as a general expression for the complete living man still in this life, much as the distress signal SOS is sometimes popularly interpreted as save our souls, meaning save our lives. Or again, as we might say, there were 150 souls on board when the vessel sailed. To describe a complete thing by a part is quite a common figure of speech, as when we say so-and-so took sail for Europe. The passage you quote, therefore, has no reference to the nature of the soul in itself, and no application whatever to the question as to whether it is immortal or not.
Psalm 23:19 says that the soul is subject to death.
The verse you mentioned says that the eye of the Lord is upon them that hope in him, to deliver their souls from death, to keep them alive in famine. The last word should have shown you that the reference is to continued bodily life in this world, requiring the presence of the soul in the body. The text does not refer to the condition of the soul after death has separated it from the body.
In the book of Ecclesiastes, we read, "Whatever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest."
That is true, but the sacred author is warning us simply that death ends all our activities in this world. He is referring in no way to what occurs beyond the grave. He speaks as any normal man would speak in similar circumstances. Thus, immediately prior to those words, he said, "This is thy labor which thou takest under the sun." He intends, therefore, that death will end all opportunities of activity so far as life this side of the grave is concerned. How true this is you will discover by going to a cemetery and inviting those buried there to assist you in some enterprise or to benefit you by their advice and instruction. But to the condition of the soul in the next world to which it has gone, the text has no reference whatever. And any ambiguity you might like to imagine is removed by the very author you quote, for in chapter 12, verse 7 of the same book, we read that when a man dies, the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit to God who gave it. It is against all sound principles of interpretation to forsake passages quite clear in themselves for fantastic opinions based upon strained and forced meanings read into texts which fit in quite well with the clearer passages if taken reasonably.
The words in the text, "whither thou goest," indicate that more than the body goes to the grave. It means man's whole being.
The personal pronoun is quite legitimately used without any implication concerning the future lot of the soul. If I were to say, "When I die, bury me in the family grave," no reasonable person could argue from that I did not believe in the immortality and survival of the soul.
Well, it seems to me that the dead lie unconscious in the grave until Christ's second coming.
Well, St. Paul tells us that the thought of death was most attractive to him. Why? Was it that he might lie unconscious in the grave? No, it was that he might be with Christ, which is far better than living on still in this world.
Isaiah 10:18 says that the glory of the forest shall be consumed from the soul even to the flesh.
That is a typical Hebraism intending no more than the complete destruction of living things from the face of the earth in a given area. The text has no reference to the immortality of the soul of man. Without any notion of the sense of a passage, some people have but to see the word soul, and at once they conclude that they have further evidence of what they want to believe. It is useless to quote passages whose sane and normal explanation does not touch the question of the soul's immortality against others which admit of no other explanation save that the soul is not subject to death as is the body.
Matthew 10:28 speaks of the destruction of both soul and body in hell.
In the passage you quote, Christ says, "Fear not them that kill the body and are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear them that can destroy both body and soul in hell." The first part of this text shows clearly that the death of the body inflicted by men does not involve the death of the soul. The soul, therefore, survives the death of the body and is immortal. The second part of the text refers to the eternal and living death of all bodily comfort and of all the soul's fondest aspirations which God will inflict on the wicked at the last judgment. According to Christ, this will mean continued consciousness in a never-ending state of misery where the worm of remorse dieth not and the fire is not extinguished. No wonder he warns us that this is the evil fate we should fear rather than a temporal death which affects the body only and cannot wreck our eternity. The passage justifies and does not militate against the doctrine that the soul is immortal.
Do you think the soul of David has survived and is in heaven?
I have no doubt at all as to that fact.
In John 3:13, Christ says, "No man hath ascended into heaven."
That was strictly true when Christ spoke. By the sin of our first parents, heaven was closed against human souls. Christ himself was the eternal Son of God who came to redeem mankind and who opened heaven to men by his death, resurrection, and ascension. Christ himself was the eternal Son of God who came to redeem mankind and who opened heaven to men by his death, resurrection, and ascension. At his ascension, he was the first in human form to enter heaven. With him, at the same time, went the souls of the just who had died previously in God's grace and friendship. And good souls now who go from this world find their heavenly reward quite accessible to them. Thus Christ said, "I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you also may be." St. Paul, therefore, longed for death, saying, "I desire to be with Christ, which is far better."
St. Peter said, "David ascended not into heaven."
The soul of David did not and could not enter heaven until Christ had paid the price of sin on Calvary and had himself entered heaven in his own glorified human nature. The fact that the soul of David did not go to heaven immediately when he died does not exclude his admission to heaven after Christ had opened heaven to men. Until then, the soul of David was amongst those spirits to whom the still living soul of Christ went after his death on the cross, as we find in 1 Peter 3, verses 18 and 19.